I'm here with Alora Chistiakoff, a change management executive who is presenting here at ProjectWorld, and I thought I'd stop and ask her to tell us a little bit about what you'll be presenting on today.
Well, I'm going to be talking about how you get started implementing some portfolio management, particularly in organizations that have never had it before and that don't necessarily know quite what it's going to take to get it implemented.
What are some top-of-mind tips that for many organizations, like you said, that have never implemented before that they should keep in mind?
One of the most important things to keep in mind really are decision-making rights. And in some, especially entrepreneurial organizations, that can be a really big challenge where you have a very dynamic or charismatic leader who started the company. A lot of times, if they're still with the company, they are the sole decision-making body. And the one challenge that presents for portfolio management is that makes it a subjective process instead of an objective process, which is, of course, the case when you're trying to implement a portfolio.
Now, when you compare that to, say, a larger, more monolithic enterprise that has a lot of more rigid controls, what are some of the concerns that come to mind?
Well, I think the first one really is that obviously in a more monolithic process or a larger organization, there can often be sort of a sense of facelessness and a little bit of hopelessness on the part of smaller business units when it comes to getting their projects put through the system, particularly because, a small business unit of 4 or 5 people is probably never going to be able to make a compelling enough business case to compete with some of the larger, more enterprise initiatives that get put forward. So obviously the benefit in a smaller or entrepreneurial organization is if you have a good relationship with the CEO, maybe you can get your project slipped through, or a good relationship with the CIO, you can, give them a call, take them to lunch, and you can usually get things done. So obviously it's much more difficult for smaller business units to make it through a process when you've got something objective. The flip side of that is that especially as the economy starts getting more and more concerning for everyone, making sure that your IT investment is wise and prudent and has the maximum ROI is extremely important. And I don't think that there's anybody, including the managers of smaller business units, who doesn't recognize that IT investment is expensive, and they need to make sure that they're only putting forth the things that actually are going to produce real value. Because in the end, especially in entrepreneurial organizations, a lot of times those managers are stockholders, and they want to make sure that that stock has value. The worst thing you can do is to undermine your own long-term, value for the company.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Look
you.
forward to your presentation.
It is the easiest to argue at each level of the organization is clearly visibility. For executives, one of the things that is constantly an issue in any number of organizations is they're too far removed from the actual decisions and sometimes get surprised by the fact that a project they thought was going along just fine all of a sudden got trumped in favor of something that they never saw coming. So as we started rolling out our process, we had to define what arguments we really needed to present to each of the groups involved to make sure that we had their support and their active involvement. So just really quickly, obviously, executives increased visibility over trade-offs. The downside, of course, was they had to be willing to be the bad guy. Making it visible to them meant that we either had to get their tacit or explicit acceptance and approval for the decisions that were being made. In an organization like JetBlue, where everybody prides themselves on being very friendly, one of the problems was a real reluctance to just be the bad guy and say, no, that's it, the answer's no, move on. No more debating it, no more having 50 meetings to try to be convinced otherwise. The answer's no, it's off the table, on to the next issue. And that was probably culturally one of the biggest things that we had to get past, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Obviously, finance is a really big factor here. Clearly, the purpose of portfolio management is to make sure that you're doing financially justifiable projects and you're not wasting time and resources on things that have absolutely no or little value to the organization. The downside for finance is that they're going to have to be more involved. We had a case where finance very much liked the idea of being involved, but once we actually implemented the process, it turned out they didn't have the staffing to support the level of involvement they actually requested for the process. So the level of involvement from them is critical in order to actually putting the gates in place right out of the box to get things moving. Business leaders. This was really good in some regards because obviously it gave them transparency into what projects were coming. And that was something they all liked. They all felt that IT was kind of a black hole. They'd send in requests, some of them would be approved, some of them would be denied, and they really didn't feel like they had any clear understanding of what those criteria were. Some of them would then do the end run and call the CIO to schmooze over taking the lunch or scream really, really loudly, get their stuff done, and that was great for them, but for somebody else who just lost their resources. IT leadership. The really big pro for IT leadership was that the portfolio management process really took IT out of being in the business of deciding what's best for the business, because that should not be IT's role. We should provide the information necessary to understand what an IT project is going to take, but in the end, if the business decides that, you know, this strategic project over here that's going to cost money and have no real great ROI is really what the business needs versus something tactical and revenue-based, then that's still a business decision to make. IT needs to help inform it, but IT should not be the arbiters of that decision.